Okay, so I want to talk about, as I said, two ideas. The first text is a very, very short idea from Friedrich Nietzsche, which is the idea is generally called the eternal return or the eternal reoccurrence. And it comes up in a few passages throughout Nietzsche's work. There's one specific passage in one of his books called The Gay Science, which I believe it's sort of like an aphorism, which is called the heaviest burden. And he's asking us this question. He's asking us to consider this idea of time, where what if time was on a loop and our life would end and it would play out again, end and it would play out again, end and it would play out again. And each time it would feel exactly like the same way. Okay, so that's the first idea I want to talk about. And the second idea I want to talk about, which I already mentioned a little bit, is this idea of a text from Albert Camus, which is called the Myth of Sisyphus, where he's asking us to consider how do we respond to the absurdity of life. That basically we're throwing ourselves into this life. We are sort of also stuck on a loop, wake up, go to work, wake up, go to work, wake up, go to school, wake up, go to, and it sort of all ends and it doesn't really amount to anything. So how are we supposed to respond to that? Okay. And Albert Camus sees Sisyphus, who is this titan in Greek mythology, being punished by Zeus, as providing a kind of an anecdote, an antidote, a sort of a solution to the problem of the meaninglessness of life or the absurdity of life. Okay, so those are the two texts. Let's consider the first one. So imagine that basically time was on a loop. Why is he asking us to do this? Okay, first I want to talk about some different conceptions of time very quickly, and then we'll talk about this. So let's just consider this. If you come from typically a monotheistic faith, you'll have a linear sense of time. Okay, there's creation, there's the beginning, there's the story of in Genesis, the story of creation in Genesis, and then there's a linear progression, and then there's finally the trials and tribulation and the day of judgment and reckoning, and finally there's a sort of an end. Okay, there's a sort of linear trajectory, and we as well, we are along this trajectory. You are born and then you die, and that's it. So the idea here is that you only live once, and you are going to be judged by the choices that you made, the things that you did while you were alive. And that's it. That's all you have, is that one go. There's only one ticket. Okay, you only get one ride. That's not the only conception of time. If you look at different other worldviews, primarily what you get in what you call the Dharmic religions that come out of India, such as primarily Hinduism and Buddhism, to name the two main ones, is you get a sense of reincarnation, and time is understood as cyclical. Okay, the universe did not necessarily have a beginning, and it doesn't necessarily have an end. That is called what is called the wheel of samsara. Okay, it just kind of recycles itself. It just kind of takes what is and makes new things, and it continually goes around and around and around. And consequently, life is also understood, whereas here life is understood as linear, here life is understood as cyclical. And so you get this idea of reincarnation. The sense of life also kind of plays into the understanding of time. And I just want to say one thing here. We might talk about this a little bit later on when we talk about death towards the second half of the semester. But here the problem with death is that there's a finality to it. When you die, it's over. Okay. The problem with death is that death is real, is that there is no immortality in a sense. But if you flip paradigm and you look at it from the perspective of this worldview, the problem of death in this worldview is that it's not final. Okay, is that it's never ending. Okay, here the problem with death is that it's sad because your life comes to an end. Here the problem with death is that at one point you start to figure out that you've had all of these rebirths, and at one point you want to get off the wheel. Okay, but you can't. The Ferris wheel keeps going round and round, and you with it. Okay. We can also make a distinction between subjective time and objective time. Okay, in ancient Greece, they had two different deities. They had a deity for Chronos, represented the sort of chronological, linear, objective, quantifiable, quantitative time, okay? Minutes, seconds, hours, days, weeks. And there's some importance to that, okay? But there's also this other dimension of time, which was captured by another deity, Kyrios, that is the subjective sense of time. And we all know from our own subjective experiences that those two things do not necessarily align, okay? There are different circumstances that can alter your sense of time perception. If you're flipping a car off a highway, time sort of distorts. If you're having fun, they say time flies when you're having fun. And when you're bored, you're, let's say, attending a lecture that isn't very interesting for you, or you're daydreaming, time kind of seems to stand still. Okay, so that's interesting. Okay, I don't want to talk too much a little more about that, but if that's interesting, if you're interested in the psychology of that, then you should look into different studies. What are different factors? What are certain kind of brain conditions that alter the experience of time flow? There is one thing that I do want to say here, and then we'll get into Nietzsche's idea specifically, is this is what I came across, and it seems to have some basis, but basically, when have you lived half your life? When have you lived half, so assuming that you're going to live, let's say, to the average age, which is most people live to about their late 80s, early 90s, late 80s. When have you lived half your life? So if you're looking at it quantitatively, you would say you reach the midway point of your life when you're about 40, 45 years old, all right? But subjectively, when have you lived half your life? And some people have said that once you've reached the age of 20 years old, so right about where you guys are for the most part, once you reach the age of 20 years old, you've lived half your life, subjectively speaking. Okay. Now, how does that make sense? First of all, you can understand it in terms of, it's sort of your internal clock, your metabolism. There is more lived experience in the first, there is as much lived experience in the first 20 years of your life as there will be in the next 65 years of your life. Okay, this is kind of that's one way to put it. And one way to understand that is, imagine the day in the life of, let's say, a 1-year-old. There's a lot of living, there's a lot of novelty, there's a lot of experience, okay? There's a lot of new experiences. Contrast that, let's say, to the day in the life of a 100-year-old. First of all, a day in the life of a 1-year-old, that day in the total lifespan of the 1-year-old is a lot proportionally to the duration of that person's life. Whereas one day in the life of a 100-year-old is, proportionally speaking, in terms of proportions, a lot less. All right. And you also have to understand it sort of physiologically and sort of your biological clock. The day in the life of a 10-year-old, gets a lot of living done. There's a lot of running around. There's a lot of excitement. Okay. When you get to about 80 years old, you slow down. Okay. You can't cover as much ground as you do when you're 10 years old. So something to consider, okay? Maybe that's a terrible thing that maybe you wish that I didn't tell you, but something to consider, okay? And one of the reasons why you should consider that is because we all feel as though, and this is what we might talk about with Miguel de Unamuno, if we talk about Miguel de Unamuno. Miguel de Unamuno says, we all feel as though we're gonna live forever. We see other people die, but we do not, we truly cannot contemplate our own non-existence. So that's, in some sense, a kind of a flaw. It's a kind of it's a tragedy that we therefore don't live. We don't live because we think that we're eternal. There isn't a sense of urgency. Okay, so let's proceed to what Nietzsche has to say. So this is the idea. Now, Nietzsche is not proposing this idea as a kind of a physics theory. He's proposing this more as a kind of a philosophical thought experiment to get us to question how we feel about our own life. Okay, so there are other sections in his writings where he proposes something like this. He kind of toys with the idea. He says, if the universe is infinite in terms of time, but finite in terms of energy, then it's just a matter. Then it's just a matter of time before all the little bits realign themselves in just the same way. In other words, it's like if you have an infinite number of monkeys banging away on an infinite number of typewriters for infinite amount of time, it's just a matter of time before they will accidentally produce all the great works in literature. It's just a matter of time before they reproduce, the Encyclopedia Britannica and everything in Wikipedia. Just by, you get the point. That's not really the point. Is how would you feel? This is the central question, and this is what I want you to retain. And what is he trying to advocate with this? What's the sort of attitude? The question is, how would you feel if you had to relive your life, this life that you now live, over and over again, and each time felt exactly as though it was exactly this time? In other words, each time felt subjectively as though it was just the first time. So that your life was a sort of a loop. Your life was, let's say, a film. You know what I mean? You play the film, and the characters are always the same. It plays out in exactly the same way, except the film will last maybe 2 hours, and your life will last 80 years. And maybe there are moments in your life that are not as exciting as a lot of the moments in the film. The film is a lot more dense in terms of its action. But it's the same principle, that you die and your life begins from the start, and you have no recollection that I've lived this life a million times already, and I'm going to live it a million times over and over. But he's asking the question, how would you feel about that prospect? And what does your answer to the question? If I were to ask you, would you want to relive your life over and over again, exactly this life, exactly as you have lived it, and exactly as you will live it over and over again, without any change, and each time feels exactly like the first time, without any recollection? How would you feel about that? And Nietzsche sort of asking the question is, what does your answer reveal? Okay, and where would he like us to go? What sort of attitude towards this hypothetical scenario is Nietzsche trying to cultivate in us? Okay, he's trying to cultivate a specific attitude. So let me just this is the passage, the heaviest burden. Let me read it very quickly, and then we'll sort of unpack it. But it's more of a thought experiment. It's more of a kind of an exercise to get you to think about how you feel about your life. Okay, and again, trying to cultivate a specific attitude towards life. So here we go. Let me just read it. What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you this? So here it is. This is the proposal. This life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it. But every pain and every joy, every thought and sigh, everything unutterably small and great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider and the moonlight between the trees, and this moment and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. And the question, how would you feel about this? Would you throw yourself down and gash at your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or, and this is the point, this is what he's trying to get us, this sort of attitude that he wants us to have. Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? So that's the question. So let's unpack it. He said, if I ask this question in class, normally I do, okay, if we're in a classroom, how many people would want to relive their life exactly as they have lived it over and over again? And there's quite a few hands that go up, okay? Some students are a lot of students are sort of undecided. And there's always a few students that say, no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Okay, now what's the idea here? The idea is that all moments, whether they were what you regard as the big moments or even small moments, are going to repeat themselves infinitely, and you're going to experience that moment subjectively in its full magnitude. And so this is the point, is a lot of people will say yes to this question if they judge that thus far they have lived a life which is pretty good. In other words, the good outweighs the bad. The good moments were pretty good. Yeah, there were bad moments, but yeah, sure, I'll endure them for the good moments. And the people that normally say, no, I wouldn't want to relive my life over and over again, is because there are some events, some tragedies, some experiences that were very, very profound and very, very heavy and dark, if you want to put it that way. And you say, I under no, in other words, it's done and I lived it, and I wouldn't ever want to wish it on anybody else, or I would never want anybody to relive that vicariously, subjectively, in all its magnitude. It's done, and in some sense, I'm glad it's done. And the idea of having to play my life out again makes that event, which was such a, it was a sort of a treacherous, torturous moment to go through. It was an episode. The idea of having to relive my life and over again makes that now real. It sort of makes it a permanent feature that I would rather just kind of completely do away with it. It exists only in my memory now. And thankfully, now as I grow older, my memory is going to kind of fade away and I don't have to deal with it anymore. And when I die, it's gone. Okay. No, it's gone. The experience is gone, and good that it's gone. Okay. Nietzsche wants us to cultivate this attitude, which I'm going to describe right now. And Nietzsche, this is the point. This is the point. Is Nietzsche lived a pretty hard life. Okay. Surely he had some, as he calls, some great moments. Okay. He had some tremendous moments in his life, but his life was also plagued with sort of illness and discomfort and disappointment and so on. So he had a pretty hard life. Nietzsche had a pretty bad life in many respects. But nonetheless, he says, I want to develop a certain attitudes towards life as a whole, wherein I would say, for whatever it was, whether I judge it as good or bad, I would say, yes, I would want to really, this radical affirmation of life itself, this embracing of life, that you say, for whatever it was, whether I judge it as good or bad, it was this unique thing. It was this unique experience, which was entirely my own, okay? And for whatever the content was, it was something special, all right? So Nietzsche says, we want to try to cultivate the attitude where we have a sort of a general, kind of a philosophical, spiritual, but a general attitude towards life itself. That we say, yeah, oh yeah, life is worth living, you know? When I die, throw me back in, exactly nothing changed. This radical affirmation of, in some sense, affirming the beauty and the wonder and the mystery of life in and of itself, despite its particular expression or despite its specific content, if that makes sense. That Nietzsche is going to say, he says, even if your whole life was shit, okay, it was just kind of torment and abuse and garbage. He says, even if there was just one moment, one spark where you experienced genuine love or genuine friendship, or a moment of just beauty, or a moment of peace or serenity, or a moment of triumph, or a moment of overcoming, even if it was just for a minute, okay? Even if it was just for a minute, he says, the whole history of the universe is justified, okay? If there's just one moment where, just in that moment, it makes sense, even if it just makes sense for one minute, okay? He says, everything else, the confusion, the ignorance, the mystery, the darkness of it, the bad shit in this world, it's all justified, okay? It's a very powerful affirmation of life, okay? And there's two ways to look at it. This way, there's kind of, let me say two or three more things. One way to look at it is that on reflection, my life is not on a loop, okay? So what does that imply? It implies that, well, first of all, what is done is done. So this attitude with regards to the past, is, for whatever it was what it was, okay? So in other words, embrace it, that whatever it was, it made you who you are. So you shouldn't have, in some sense, regret, Okay, you can sort of toy with the idea of, well, what if I did this, and what if I did that, and what if I kissed it, what if I kissed this girl, and what if I quit that job, and what would have happened, what if I did this, what if I didn't do that? And you can sort of entertain it intellectually. But the point is, you shouldn't live with any regret, because whatever has happened to you has made you into who you are. And for that, you should be grateful. So in some sense, if you reach the end point of your life and you're on your deathbed, you should have sort of this looking back perspective, looking back on your past. And you say, for whatever it was what it was. And it was the story of my life. And it was a pretty far out story. It had its ups and its downs and round. And it was a pretty far out trip. Okay. So that attitude towards the past and the attitude towards the future is that my life is not on loop. It's not deterministic. It's not set in stone as though like it was on a film reel. So therefore, with regards to the future, let me live my life now in such a way that I would want to relive it over and over again, that I would want to seek those moments that sort of give a justification or a meaning to life, that I would want to then say, yes, affirmatively, yes, I would want to relive this life over and over again. Okay. And what does it do? What this has done for me is it has made me sort of spontaneous in a way. Entertaining your life as being on a kind of a loop sort of makes you paradoxically, it has made me spontaneous and act sort of contrary to my daily habits, which is something that you should have. You should sort of have that habit of being able to spontaneously do other than your habitual programming. Okay, but what is he trying to say here? Again, the main point is what he calls amour fati is, let me skip over this. Okay, this is an idea that is used in Milan Kundera uses this as well. This idea of what he calls amour fati is this love of faith, love in a deep sort of philosophical and spiritual way, whatever life has thrown at you. Okay, for this is your life. Okay, nobody else can live it. It's completely your own. It's completely unique. And for whatever it is, okay, whether you judge it as being good or bad, it's sort of complete unto itself. Okay, he says, I want to try to cultivate this attitude where I want to be a yes sayer. Okay, I want to say yes to life itself. I want to embrace life as a whole. All right. So that's the first idea, this idea of the eternal reoccurrence. If you have any questions or comments with regards to that, otherwise let's jump into the next one, which is the myth of Sisyphus. Hold on, what's going on here? So this is Albert Camus. Albert Camus is a French philosopher, a French existentialist, French Algerian philosopher, existentialist, writer, friend of Jean-Paul Sartre, died at a fairly young age in a car crash. So maybe, I think some of you are familiar with Albert Camus. So Albert Camus writes this essay called the Myth of Sisyphus. And this is Sisyphus in the background, okay? Sisyphus is punished by Zeus. He is involved in opening up Pandora's box and all this stuff. And he is punished by Zeus. And the punishment is that he is thrown into this realm. It's a realm, it's kind of a barren realm. It's barren. There's nothing there except for a mountain and this giant boulder. And the punishment is that Sisyphus has to roll the boulder to the top of the mountain. And as soon as the boulder has reached the top of the mountain, what happens is the boulder rolls back down of its own weight. Okay, just gravity pulls it back down. So all this struggle, all this exerting oneself towards the fulfillment of a task, which ultimately unravels and amounts to nothing. So Albert Camus sees the myth of Sisyphus as sort of capturing, he sees this as a kind of a symbolic representation of our life, of the absurdity of our life, is that life is a kind of a perpetual even habitual struggle, all of this energy directed towards what? Okay, ultimately the accomplishment of nothing. Okay, ultimately we all die. Okay, we push, in some sense, that is our living. Our living is we are pushing the boulder up to the top of the mountain, and ultimately the boulder comes unraveled. Okay, there's nothing that you can do. There's nothing that you can take with you into the afterlife. And even if you say, well, I'm going to leave behind, a family, I'm going to leave behind a legacy, I'm going to leave behind whatever, a charity or a legacy, everything is, given a long enough timeline, everything is eroded, everything is washed away. So the question that Albert Camus is asking is, what do we do with regards to this philosophical thing which is always lingering in the background, which is the potential meaninglessness of life? Okay, so again, that's what we talked about a little bit with Sartre as well. We touched upon it a little bit at the beginning of the semester. We talked about it with Jean-Paul Sartre. Is the prospect of a meaningless life, the prospect that truly fundamentally life is meaningless. The French existentialists are they're concerned with this, the meaninglessness of life, and that is sort of expressed as a kind of an absurdity, that life is absurd. Where here, there really is no basis. There's nothing that has to get done. We get caught up in all of these activities, all of these projects that ultimately amount to nothing. Okay. And he sees Sisyphus, basically, let me get to the point here, is he sees Sisyphus as giving us a sort of antidote to this absurdity of life. Because for Albert Camus, he says he's curious about Sisyphus. So why does he do what he does? Why it's kind of the absurdity even more so than our lives. Our lives, at least, they come to an end. Okay, there is a finality to it. For Sisyphus, it's going to be forever and ever. Sisyphus is still rolling the rock up to the top of the hill. So Albert Camus is interested. Why does he not rebel? Why does he not resist? Why does he not try to kill himself? Why does he not try to run away? Why does he not sit down and protest? Why does he engage in the task? What is Sisyphus doing? What is he on to? Okay, maybe Sisyphus understood something. Okay, that's what Albert Camus maybe Sisyphus has understood something. So that's the question. Okay, so here we go. It says the question of the meaning of life. He says there's only one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is the question of suicide. Is life worth living? Okay, is the game worth the candle? Should we even bother with it? And the idea is that somehow, explicitly or implicitly, we've all answered that question. We've all answered the question of basically deciding, yeah, maybe life is worth living. There is some game here that is worth the candle. Okay, it's worth enduring the rest, because there is some game that seems to have some benefit to it, or some value in it, at least some aesthetic joy in it. Okay, is it worth it? Is it worth being here? We are stuck in these bodies. We are limited by our senses. Is there suppose there is no meaning, is there nonetheless something about this experience, something about being a human being on this particular planet, given the human condition that we're faced with, that gives us some meaning? Okay, so or like some cults have done, some religious cults and some religious sects, like Heaven's Gate. You guys don't know, this is a lot older. This is stuff that happened when I was really young. Okay, even older, even before I was born, like Jonestown Massacre. You just have a cult and you just commit collective suicide. Or Heaven's Gate, let's all eat the Jello and all commit collective suicide. Right? Very, very interesting phenomenon. There's no other animal that does that, committing collective suicide. That's special. So what Albert Camus is going to say is sort of like, there are some instances where you judge that life is not worth living and you kill yourself. That is not that, that goes back to Stoicism in a way. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. If you talk about, let's say, physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia at old age, it's okay. You know, I lived my life, and my life was good, and now I've reached the end, and I don't want to live anymore because my life is basically coming to an end in the next few weeks. All I have to look forward to is chronic pain. So it's okay. I had a good run. You know what I mean? Let me die in dignity. That's fair. You know what I mean? Life was meaningful. It's no longer meaningful, and it's okay. Now, the problem is a lot of people that contemplate suicide and attempt suicide, a lot of people that have attempted suicide and have failed in their attempt, in other words, they continue living, have basically regretted the attempt, okay? And they basically regard it as a kind of an act of God's good grace that they're still alive. Because they said, if I would have killed myself, I would have been making a mistake, okay? I had watched a documentary for some reason a while back on the Golden Gate Bridge. The Golden Gate Bridge is basically one of the main suicide attractions in the world for some reason. There's something about the Golden Gate Bridge, jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. There are hundreds of people that jump off the Golden Gate Bridge every year. And there was one specific person that was interviewed in this documentary that jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and he survived. And he says, as soon as my feet left the bridge and I was in free fall, I immediately regretted it. Okay. So I'm not saying that everybody that jumps off the bridge immediately regrets it, but even if a few people regret it, it's too bad. I would imagine that the majority of them regret it. Okay. So the question is it worth it? Is life worth it? That's the basic point. Okay. Judging whether life is not worth living for Albert Camus is the fundamental philosophical question. He says everything else is secondary. Okay. Is it worth it? Is life worth it? Very interesting question. Okay. And in some sense, we all have to answer that question, explicitly or implicitly. Presumably, we all implicitly judge that life is worth it. Okay. And maybe, I don't know, you should be able to articulate it. You should try to articulate it and ask yourself, what is it that gives my life the meaning which makes life worth it? Okay. It says all the rest, whether the world has 3 dimensions or whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, all of this comes after. Okay. This is whether the earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the earth. He says is a matter of profound indifference. It is a futile question. It says, on the other hand, this is very interesting here. He says, on the other hand, I see many people die because they judge that life is not worth living, as we had mentioned. Okay, you commit suicide because you judge that it's over. There's no more meaning for you. But he says, I also see paradoxically others getting killed for ideas or illusions which give them a reason for living. What is called a reason for living is also an excellent reason for dying. So just entertain that. Okay, if you think about somebody who dies as a martyr, their meaning is more important than their living. It's more important to have a meaning than to just go on living. And that is expressed by the fact that some people would rather die for what gives their life meaning rather than go on living, having forfeited that meaning. So meaning is more important than living. Okay. If living has any value, it's because you found meaning in it. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a little bit abstract, but hopefully that makes sense. So even Martin Luther King, who was in some sense a martyr for a cause which gave his life meaning, says, I submit that if a man has not discovered something that he will die for, he isn't fit to live. That's pretty heavy. Okay, I'm not even sure if I'd be able to answer that question. Well, what is it? What is that thing which you would be willing to die for? But you see the point. Okay, so let's see what he sees in Sisyphus. So as we described, Sisyphus is condemned to ceaselessly roll a rock to the top of the mountain, and then it rolls back of its own weight. Okay, and he says, look at this. This is the kind of the distillation, the symbolic representation of a completely pointless task. Okay, and part of the punishment is that you can imagine that it's psychologically tormenting, not only physically agonizing and painful, but it's psychologically tormenting because it's a perfectly pointless task. Okay, it's perfectly meaningless. That's why Albert Camus is interested in Sisyphus, because it's a perfectly meaningless task. Okay, we cannot imagine, he says, a more dreadful punishment than futile and hopeless labor, and even pointless labor. Okay. Something that came up in the other class. Meaning, okay, it's like going back to what we talked about with South. He says you can be in prison and you can nonetheless find meaning. Okay, you can be in prison and you can be free as to choose as to what you're going to do in response to the circumstances of being in prison. Are you going to join a gang? Are you going to throw yourself in solitary isolation? Are you going to read a book? You're going to write a book. You're going to plan your escape. You're going to plan what you're going to do when you get out. There's that meaning. That meaning is what drives you. Okay. Similarly, there was I can't believe I forget his name right now. A Jewish author, okay, who talks about his experience in the concentration camps. I can't believe the name eludes me right now. I'm so disappointed in myself. And he basically says the people who survived are the people that had retained a sense of meaning. It's your sense of meaning that gives you a purpose to go on enduring, to go on struggling. Okay, the people that had died were the people that had lost their sense of meaning, that had lost their sense of hope and purpose, that gave them the strength to endure the absurdity and the atrocity of the situation that they found themselves in. Okay, I think it's Man's Search for Meaning. The book is called, and the author eludes me, disappoints me. It's probably going to flash into my head any second. Sisyphus is the absurd hero, and in some sense he captures an aspect of our life. Our life is also on this sort of the loop. Okay, you wake up, you go to school. You wake up, you go to school. You wake up, you go to school.
Sir?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
The author for Man's Search for Meaning is Viktor E. Frankl. I have the book right here.
Yeah, there it is. Okay, thank you, Viktor Frankl. Very good, thank you. So there's a similarity there with what Sisyphus Camus is describing with Sisyphus. Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. That basically, but our life is on a loop like that. Okay, not in that we are faced with a sort of life or death situation that we really have to look into our souls. Thankfully, that is not the case for many of us, that we have to look into our souls and ask, what is worth fighting for? Is life worth living in this meaningless atrocity, whether it be the Second World War or a concentration camp, but even the sort of the mundaneness and the futility of our lives. Let's say he talks about, let's say the worker. You wake up, you go to work. You wake up like my father did basically the same thing for about 40 years, the same task for about 40, 45 years. You wake up, you go to work, you wake up, you go to work. Now, if we have, you feel that maybe as a student, wake up, go to school, wake up, go to school, wake up. So when is this going to end? And you can only fantasize that, yeah, it is going to come to an end. In a year, 2 or 3 years, I'm going to be done with college. You're going to go to university. But this kind of repetitive futility, and Sisyphus sort of distills that to its basic repetitive meaninglessness. So he kind of captures it. It's kind of some symbolic representation of the meaninglessness, the potential meaninglessness of our life. But he says, now, how are we supposed to understand? What attitude does Sisyphus have? Okay, why does he not rebel? Why does he not curse Zeus? Why does he not try to kill himself or run away? Okay, he says, but it is during the pause, in other words, at the top of the mountain, when the boulder just basically finishes rolling down the hill, that pause, when Sisyphus is watching the boulder roll back down the hill, he says, it is in that pause that Sisyphus interests me. At each of these moments, when he leaves the height and gradually sinks towards the layers, he is he is superior to his fate. He is stronger than his rock. So how? He's trying to understand this. Okay, this I'd mentioned. So one way of understanding this is, you can understand it from the perspective of another Greek titan, is Prometheus. Prometheus is also punished by Zeus, and for 30,000 years he is chained to a rock, and every day a vulture or an eagle comes down and rips him open and eats his liver. Okay, and he has to experience this every day, and every night he regenerates, and the next day the same thing repeats itself. He is ripped open by this bird of prey, and he is basically, he has to watch himself get eaten alive, and every night he regenerates, and this is going to take place for 30,000 years. Now, Prometheus's attitude is he's not going to give Zeus the satisfaction of his punishment. He's not going to show the pain. Okay, so he does it. It's kind of a scornful attitude. He does it out of spite. Okay, he kind of says, "Fuck Zeus. I'm not going to let Zeus get. I'm not going to get Zeus have his satisfaction." Okay, so basically, like, understand it as the world. Let the world throw what it will at me. Okay, let it throw another curveball at me. I'm going to endure. And there's a kind of a satisfaction of enduring, of kind of weathering a storm. Okay, but there's a kind of a grit. There's grit. That's the word. You're kind of grinding your teeth. It's like, and you're doing it out of even if it's pointless, even if it's a pointless struggle. Okay, I'm going to endure it to the bitter end, just so that I can say that there's some satisfaction in the enduring it itself. Okay, so like I don't know, like a soldier that you know that defeat is inevitable, but you don't surrender. You grind your teeth to the bitter end. Okay, you put up a really good fight, and there's some satisfaction in that. Okay, so that's what Prometheus does, and that's one potential way of looking at what Sisyphus is doing. Sisyphus is going to roll the rock up the hill out of spite, okay, to basically give the middle finger to Zeus, that you're not going to break me. This is not sufficient to break me, and there's some satisfaction in that. That's one way of understanding potentially what Sisyphus is doing, and you can understand that, as I said, as an attitude towards life. That even if it's hard, I'm going to weather the storm, just because I want to, for no other reason, just to see if I can. Okay, but Albert Camus sees no. There's something else what Sisyphus is doing, and this is probably the better interpretation. Sisyphus, he says, becomes sort of fascinated with the world that he's in. He becomes there. He finds a kind of an aesthetic dimension in the rock, in the mountain. He starts to understand. He starts to basically fall in love with. He starts to become passionate. He becomes passionate about the task. Okay, he starts to fall in love with the rock and the mountain, and he starts to kind of play with it. Okay, when he's at the top of the mountain, he says, "Look, if I let the rock go this way, it goes down this trajectory. It kind of swerves, and then it does a little jump at the end. If I let the rock go down this way, you start to understand all the nuances, all the details, all the nuance, all the trajectories, the physics of it." And he becomes sort of fascinated by it in a way. So he says, I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one burden again, but Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He concludes that all is well. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain in itself forms a world. So what do you get? This is what you get. It's very interesting that Zeus puts Sisyphus in a kind of a sterile, meaningless world. And that in and of itself was supposed to be the punishment. Okay. And if you take Zeus's definition, if you define yourself by Zeus's interpretation, Zeus's perspective, then it is a punishment. Okay. Because you are defining it as being objectively meaningless. What Sisyphus has done is almost like a flower that blooms out of a barren landscape in a way. Sisyphus has found, he hasn't found meaning. Okay, that's incorrect, because there is no meaning to be found. He has made meaning. He has discovered, he has not, again, discovered is not the wrong word. He has made for himself meaning in a meaningless world. Okay, so that's what we said with Sartre. Sartre is, if you try to find meaning, you're not going to find it. You have to make meaning. Okay, so that's beautiful in a way. In a sterile world, Sisyphus finds something which gives him a reason to go on living. He falls in love with the mountain and with the rock and with all the curvatures and all the edges and all the nuances and all the details of the rock and the mountain. And it becomes a kind of a game for him. It becomes a kind of, you can imagine Sisyphus as experiencing meaning. You can imagine Sisyphus as experiencing beauty, okay? You can imagine Sisyphus as experiencing satisfaction, okay? That again, it is not the circumstances that have defined him, but it's how he has responded to those circumstances. And he has put his own perspective, his own paradigm onto this world, which has given him a paradigm which has allowed him to escape the paradigm of Zeus. He has found meaningless. He has found meaning in the meaninglessness. Okay, and the idea is that we should do the same. We should find something in the circumstances of our life, which though themselves are sort of barren, they're bare bones, and are meaninglessness. They are meaningless in and of themselves. We can make meaning out of them, and the meaning comes therefore not from the environment, but from ourselves. Okay, so he says the struggle towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart, and one must imagine Sisyphus is happy. We all have our own burden. As the Christians say, we all have to carry our own cross. Now, what attitude are you going to take in carrying it? Okay, you can lament, and you might find meaning in lamenting. The attitude is entirely on your own. Is entirely your own, and that's very interesting. Okay. So that's what we get. That's what we get with, just to end with sort of Stoicism. This would be the idea that we get from Prometheus. If it is endurable, then endure it and stop complaining. Okay, there's some satisfaction in just weathering the storm, but also sort of find something meaningful. And if you don't find it meaningful, then this is what this is Epictetus. It is the difficulty that shows what men are. So he said this is the open door policy. The open door policy is, look, just as children, when the game gets boring, they say, I don't want to play the game anymore. So should you. When the game of life gets boring, or the task at hand gets boring, then walk away from it. Okay. Don't stick around and complain. You are free to walk away. Okay. The open door policy. So even if you judge that life is not worth living, truly not worth living, it's okay. You're free to leave. Okay. The open door policy. That's it, guys. That's all I have to say. So those two will also be on the test. If you have any questions or comments, let's address them now.